Welcome to Drinks and Diplomacy, where we're cheersing to key players in foreign policy. My name is Andrea Castillo, and I'm so excited to be here with everybody. I am one of your hosts for today's podcast, and just to tell you a little bit about myself, I work as a program officer at World Oregon, doing a lot of work with international visitor programs, being able to talk a little bit about our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative, as well as doing a little bit work around the organization, doing fundraising and all that fun stuff. And I'm here today with my amazing co-host,
Tim Horgan. I'm the Executive Director at the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. Thanks so much for everyone joining us here today. We are so excited to get these conversations started and hope that you gain insights into global affairs by listening to this series of discussions. We're also super excited to have the President and CEO of the World Affairs Councils of America, Bill Clifford, with us here today to chat about how foreign policy functions from a U.S. perspective. However, most importantly, of course, since we are called the Drinks and Diplomacy podcast, the drinks coming first in our name, we will be talking a little bit about what each of us are drinking. Bill, I'll turn it over to you to do a short introduction about yourself. And what did you bring for your drink for this episode?
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Andrea. It's a pleasure to be with you. And as you know, and maybe some listeners may not, I lead the World Affairs Councils of America, a nonpartisan, nonprofit association based in Washington, D.C. that serves to support and represent 90 World Affairs Councils of America. I hope this podcast becomes very popular with all of them. With you two at the helm, I have no doubt. From New Hampshire to Oregon, this is a coast-to-coast affair, and I'm really excited about it. I prepared a cocktail today that is my own rendition of sangria, which is, as you know, a Spanish and Portuguese drink that is a punch essentially consisting of red wine and chopped fruit. Mine has the flavors of blood orange, black cherry, lemon zest. I've added apple and a little bit of grapefruit to it. It's delicious and refreshing. And I learned, as I did a little research into the history of it, that it actually got popular in our hemisphere in the 18th century, but probably originated from the West Indies or the Caribbean, where a beverage called sangria was made. And this was probably taken up by the Spanish explorers, and it means bloodletting. So how appropriate was that?
Maybe appropriate, but not so appealing anymore. I enjoy a good glass of sangria, but not if either I need to be bloodletted or it is the result of bloodletting. Either way, I'm not sure I'm on board anymore.
Well, it's a red drink anyway, Tim. And interestingly, the European Union allows only the two Iberian nations of Spain and Portugal to call it sangria under their regulations. But there are a whole range of punches out there, including Pimm's, which is another favorite, the British drink that's gin-based. I almost opted for that, but since we're recording and talking about the deeper issues of foreign policy, I thought I'd try to keep a light drink.
Well, I do like a good sangria. I have always found adding a touch of blackberry brandy is nice, particularly on a cold day like we have here in New Hampshire and DC. But I know that things are looking a little brighter over in Oregon today. So, Dre, how about you? What did you bring?
Well, okay, so we're talking about key players in foreign policy today, and it made me think a lot about who those are. And for me, the first thing that comes to mind is like a state dinner, and like what kind of drink would we have when we're all together, or we were all together in person at one of these state dinners for the visitor programs. And I thought of wine. So I decided to bring my favorite wine, which is Stella Rose. It's in Oregon and it's 5:00 in Brazil. So I think that we're okay. So just thinking about, I didn't really delve as deep into the history as Bill did for sangria, but, I'm here cheersing with everyone, taking sips of my wine as we have this discussion I'm super excited about. What about you, Tim? What'd you bring?
I went very basic in terms of my thinking here, but I went with the diplomat cocktail. We're talking foreign policy, diplomats do a lot of foreign policy, so why not have a drink named after them? And we've got some sweet and extra dry vermouth in here. We've got some maraschino liqueur and some orange bitters, as well as, if you want to, really spice things up and make it look super fun, you can do your orange zest twist, if you will. But again, just sort of thinking about what would people be drinking after that state dinner when they're really talking about the key issues. The media's gone. We've all had our food. We're full. We're feeling good. Let's have a drink that will really get the key issues of foreign policy done. So that's why I picked the diplomat drink for today's episode. So one thing that I did not mention to you guys before, because I just thought of this, but I feel like we should all have a cheers, and perhaps a cheers in your favorite language or the cheers that you know of the most. So you can choose, and we'll do a little countdown and see what we get. All right. You ready?
Yeah, ready.
Bill, you ready?
Ready for it.
All right. All right. So 3, 2, 1. Prost.
Salud.
Kampai.
Kampai. Perfect. Well, thank you so much. All right. With that out of the way, I think we should probably use some of our time here today to actually get to the topic we wanted to. Again, what we're looking to do with this podcast is really help people better understand how foreign policy works. And so we figured it would be good to have a conversation with Bill about just sort of the basic tenets of foreign policy. Who are the key players who are making foreign policy happen? What role everyday citizens can have, which is a big part of what we do in the World Affairs Council and the Global Ties US networks. So really, Bill, can you just give us sort of an initial overview of what foreign policy is, why it's important, and maybe just start off with a few of those key players?
Well, thanks, Tim. It's so great to be with you again and to have this cocktail as we're talking. Foreign policy used to be seen as a very niche area of the conduct of a nation's affairs. Often it was, diplomats who were not household names that were negotiating the fate of European nations and other nations behind closed doors. And they were the special emissaries who had a lot of power and knew each other often by family relations through, the monarchical dynasties and so forth. These days, it's very different. And especially in a democracy, the players range from presidents to, as you said, ordinary citizens. And the roles are different. The conduct is different, but really just about everybody can have an impact, and everybody, I believe, should care. That's why I'm excited to lead the World Affairs Councils of America, because we convene the whole range of leaders and policymakers, decision makers, and experts who analyze the stuff. And it's quite variable. I mean, in this country now, the president is the chief representation of America's interests. That's something that every foreign policy maker considers. From the president, there are checks and balances in our system. The Senate provides advice and consent on treaties and approval of cabinet ministers, including the Secretary of State, as well as ambassadors that serve in well over 150 embassies and consulates around the country. So those are the key players. Congress has a role as well in that it makes the budget and can tax, and also theoretically war powers. The ability to decide whether our nation goes to war is supposed to rest with Congress, although in the latter part of the 20th century, it increasingly became an executive branch function. And we could talk about that if you want in terms of the mechanics. But basically, the government players are the ones I mentioned, but a whole bureaucracy has expanded to include the National Security Council, the Homeland Security. Because of terrorism, you can make the case that the U.S. Treasury, Commerce Department, the U.S. Trade Representative, transportation, and justice are all involved, because economic issues, immigration issues, and so forth all play into how our nation interacts with the world.
Yeah, thanks so much for that kind of overview, Bill. I think it's really important once we're having these initial conversations about foreign policy, right? Who are we talking about and what role do they play inside of this discussion? And so I was really curious, kind of, if we're just touching the surface of who are a part of these conversations, how do they work together to really bridge an understanding of how foreign policy is taken out? What techniques are used to be able to really reach foreign policy goals, considering that there's so many people that play a role in the way that it's carried out?
Well, again, different interests contribute to the whole process. You'll have the State Department. Within the State Department, there's policy planning, which sort of sets the broad parameters of a president's administration's, that's where doctrines come from. That's where priorities come from. Do we recognize that climate change is a priority to combat? Do we feel that promoting democracy abroad and securing our democracy at home in recent years is a priority? Yes, we do. How about a more effective global economy that works for the American people and the middle class? How do we conduct trade policy? So within the State Department alone, there are thinkers and regional experts who contribute to that theoretical thinking about what our priorities should be. And then there is the intelligence community, which has layers of different agencies, some who are based overseas and are gathering information about what our allies are doing, especially what our adversaries are doing, non-state actors that we need to pay attention to. And in addition, there are, especially in Washington, D.C., but not limited to, international organizations that influence the global economy, that influence human rights. Also, think tanks contribute to a lot of not just analysis, but testing of ideas about what can work. And then often it ends up in Congress to legislate around these ideas, decisions about how much should we spend on foreign aid? To what extent are we going to support alliances like NATO or bilateral alliances like the one with South Korea? We have military bases overseas, and these cost money. And how much do we spend on those people and weapons and so forth that defend our country?
So, I mean, basically what you're saying is that it's super simple. Everybody is involved in.
Everybody's involved, and it's never simple. I mean, think of the problems facing the world today. And right now, one of the biggest focuses is on Ukraine and whether Russia will invade. America, our public, seems to be extremely fatigued when it comes to wars. We've just withdrawn from Afghanistan. There's been conflict in Syria and Iraq. And frankly, these have been hugely expensive. We haven't accomplished our goals in a lot of ways. That could be debated, of course, but it's resulted in a lot of broad thinking that now's a time for restraint and retrenchment and focusing on domestic issues. And yet now we have Ukraine and we have choices. Essentially, it's not just what will happen to the Ukrainian people if the military there can't hold its own against the Russian potential invaders. This conflict really says a lot about the whole liberal order after World War II, in which democratic powers, including the United States and our institutions such as the United Nations, were built around the idea that you no longer can take territory of a sovereign nation. So if this happens, are we in a new world? I would say we are. And are there knock-on effects? Sure. China's watching. They could think about, well, if that's okay there, then perhaps it's time to see what we can do in Taiwan.
Speaking of new worlds and talking about how everything is happening nowadays, I'm really curious what your thoughts are on another key player in foreign policy, which tends to be the media, and the way that all of this is communicated across various platforms, how we're talking about foreign policy, and just the role that access to information has played in who takes part in foreign policy.
The media has a really important role. First of all, now we're in an age, as you know, of 24-hour news, both on television, but also these new social media platforms that not only are conduits for important information, but disinformation and misinformation. So governments, particularly authoritarian governments that are adversaries of the United States who have influenced our elections in a negative way, can essentially use these channels to propagate its propaganda for their interests and against ours. And often these players are using it to divide our public. We see in this country, the United States now, going back to that Russia-Ukraine question, that because President Trump, whether you agree with this or not, President Trump had a different view about Russia and was very critical of our traditional alliances. And that gave Russia more space to exercise its role in a variety of ways, including disrupting our elections, but also in terms of getting our own media. I won't mention any particular channels, but let's just say our own media has been friendlier to Putin and Russia because our own president was. And that has resulted in a real deepening split where once, I would say, Republicans and Democrats, when it came to foreign policy, tended to be on the same bipartisan page.
And of course, the US is not the only one that considers foreign policy. All of these countries around the world, 191 or 93 UN recognized countries, and they're all concerned about their image abroad and how we interact. And you can take a look at the Sony hack.
Yes.
When they were going to put out the movie about Kim Jong-un in North Korea, most likely hacked all of Sony and put out a lot of information as an attempt to stop that because they were so concerned about what this meant for their image abroad, what it said about their country. And another interesting example I have for how the media plays into all this is we had a group of Russian visitors who came to the US through one of our exchange programs, and they really wanted to meet with the state police to talk about the cool technology that they use. So we set it up. We had them see cars and everything, the forensics lab. They got to, really check out what the state police uses. And at the end of it, I asked them, so what did you think? They're like, well, it was a good meeting, kind of interesting. It's like, well, isn't it what you wanted to see? And they were like, yeah, but we thought we'd see the really cool stuff, like in the Die Hard movies. And it's just, you see these sort of, mass cultural instances that people see everything and they think that all Americans live in giant cities and that we have F-22 Raptors trying to shoot a single person in LA on a daily basis or whatever the case may be. And so you really see how, as you were saying earlier, Bill, everything plays into this. Everything plays into these relationships between different countries. And you really sort of find opportunities where perhaps the foreign policy winds of the day make a major studio change their bad guy from a Chinese person to a Russian person, whatever the case may be. And I find that super interesting and something that a lot of people maybe don't think about.
The one thing I will say, you're spot on there, Tim. The one thing I will say as a former journalist, but also as a consumer, a crazy policy wonk consumer of news, is that I always encourage our public audiences, anybody really, that reading broadly, watching news that even isn't in your typical mindset. So if you're on the liberal wing, pay attention to the conservative media and vice versa, because really it's hard to get at facts. And as you form your opinion, you need really a diverse set of sources to make good decisions. That's number one. Number two, as a journalist, access is everything. And you have to always take the people who are giving you access with a grain of salt or understand that they're watching you in certain ways. When I reported in China, there was always somebody who was assigned to watch what I was doing and who I was speaking with. And that can be quite dangerous for people. I never happened to be reporting on human rights issues, but if you're engaged with someone, you could be putting their life in danger. But similarly, there gets to be a sort of groupthink in media sometimes. And after 9/11, for example, where our country was attacked like never before, the media almost assisted the government into our conflicts. And that whole weapons of mass destruction in Iraq fallacy came from that. And part of what happens is, for protection and for other reasons, this was the phase of, being embedded with the military. And your access is shaped by that interaction. So for citizens, it's paramount to really dig down. And we can talk about other ways that ordinary people can get involved in foreign affairs, but principal starting point is to engage your media consumption diversely, widely, and then deeply.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where my mentality was kind of going for this next question that I have. Just really taking an understanding from the way that people in Oregon, for example, watch movies and see life abroad, and really taking, for example, like the intricacies of movies like Encanto, talking about colonization and the role that people play around the world and how we interact and understand people's cultures, taking like a day-to-day person, somebody who is just kind of getting started with their career, or not even career, their interest in foreign policy, right? What are some ways, and why is it really important for us to really make those ties between what's going on here at home to what's happening abroad?
I'd say one principal reason is we want to get beyond stereotypes, and we hunger for human and social contact. Even in the pandemic, I mean, maybe more than ever, we've had restrictions on travel, and a lot is filtered through things like film, which is a great way to experience foreign culture, but is also oftentimes limiting, because if it isn't done with a real master director, you could end up with a lot of stereotypes about who people are in different countries. So I think it's a great gateway. And I think that's why, hey, it's great to have this cocktail, because we're all drinking different international drinks. And the same goes with food. The same goes with the visual and performing arts. Culture is a huge part of diplomacy. And in fact, you're talking about movies like Encanto and what we can receive, which is great. It's a two-way street. You know, one of the major influences that the US has around the country is Hollywood and our soft power. That has all kinds of ramifications for the conduct of foreign policy. But I think literature, movies, cuisine, that is the way we build connections and long-term bonds with folks from other countries.
Well, and a lot of what I hear from people who don't want to engage with foreign affairs is they think it's all about wars, national security, really boring, long talks at the UN, with the record for the longest speech in UN history at over 8 hours from a diplomat from India who actually, I guess, collapsed from exhaustion and came back for more. So what
Good
would you
Lord,
say?
I think there are longer ones on the Senate floor, by the way. But
I'm sure there are. You know, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Is that the movie I'm thinking of? But yeah, I mean, I think there is this feeling of, this isn't important to me because it doesn't impact my life, or, oh my God, I can't listen to another discussion on the current updates to the war in Yemen. So what would you say to those people who are like, I have limited time, I'd rather watch the latest episode of, you know, whatever current films and movies and things people are watching?
well, I mean, I think part of it isn't restricted to foreign policy, that people get fed up with what leaders are doing, elected or otherwise, because it can seem quite a remote thing that their voices are not heard, or that they are not brought in some way. That's what World Affairs Councils try to do, as you know, Tim and Andrea, is to bring people and decision makers to the public so that they can actually engage and ask questions. On every level, military, our veterans come home, and we should not forget them. They need jobs. They have defended us and deserve our respect and attention. They're giving their lives in some cases for us. So we have I would say, a duty to understand decisions that put these individuals, men and women, in the line of fire. In terms of economics, our mayors, our governors, especially not just at the federal level, are creating policies that affect citizens, whether it's to go to zero waste or to have broadband throughout their state to people who have not traditionally been able to access the internet the way some city folk do. What else? Social connections, people who work to resettle refugees who have escaped conflict areas and need to be integrated into society. All of these levels are ways that our citizenry and those who come to us are crossing borders. And if you think that, oh, the Chinese are committing a genocide in Uyghur land, that doesn't affect me. Well, that does affect us, because I would say any human whose rights are infringed means that I'm one step closer to having my rights infringed. So I believe that there is a place, an important place for voicing our opposition to human rights abuses, let alone genocide, which is the maximum abuse where you're wiping out a whole population. Everything these days, you hear it from our leaders, but it's actually true. The blurring between foreign and domestic policy is almost total. There's no decision that doesn't have an impact, both inbound and outbound, to our lives.
So one of the things that you mentioned earlier was taking the steps to take a look at our media intake, where we're getting our resources from, as well as just taking the initial step to really understanding what's going on around us. And I'm wondering, obviously, we're going to tell people, if you want to get started in foreign policy, listen to our podcast. Haha. Listen to us in Drinks and Diplomacy, right? But also, what else would you tell to somebody who's wanting to get started understanding the roles of key players in foreign policy and diplomacy? Where would you tell them to go? And on the opposite end, maybe what would you suggest to people who are already in foreign policy, who are giving these discussions, to be able to maybe widen that accessibility for people? Kind of a two-ended question for you there.
I can offer my own path as an example, and it's by no means unique, and it's not, the one that I would say, do this because I did it. Certainly. I mean, there are many ways to skin this cat, but I've had a through line. My parents invited exchange students to our home in New England summer after summer. And that's, I think, where I got the first thirst to know more about the world. Because
Hold on, Bill. You weren't inviting people to Massachusetts in the dead of winter? What's wrong with you? I mean, come on. That's the best time
have
to be here.
It just curiously was summer. But it was a great introduction to all kinds of countries. I mean, we had students, and some were high school, some were college, some were from Italy, Japan, Argentina, Poland, and many more. And as a result of this, actually, later when I was older, I actually visited some of them, and they were grown up and they had children, and it became a multi-generational friendship. But I also joined a World Affairs Club in high school, and I was in the Model UN. WACA has a program called Academic World Quest for high school students. So there are different ways to sort of have extracurricular activities that are introductory to the world of foreign affairs, which I think the word foreign should just go away. Call it global affairs, international affairs. Foreign means it's strange and it's outer. I don't even like the word. But, after that in college, I studied in Paris. I came to Washington the first time to work on Capitol Hill for a member of Congress who was involved in international relations. And then I became a journalist first I went to Japan to teach English and live in the countryside. And later I went back to Tokyo to be a journalist. So I had many different opportunities, which were so expansive to how I thought about just life, not just a perspective on a given country or how nations interact. It was people to people. It was, wow, you could work in finance. You could work in government conducting diplomacy. You could be at an international organization, or you could write a column for a newspaper. You can blog. There's so many things you can do. You can wind up in the Peace Corps or independently doing projects in countries that need access to water or haven't they're confronting, let's say, the pandemic in different ways. So they need public health help. There's many, many, many ways in a variety of fields that young people can get involved.
Well, and flipping the script a little bit, I want to ask Andrea, you come at this from a much different background. You do not have all of these great early on experiences that sort of influenced you towards the life that we all now lead of this globally focused work that we do. So can you talk a little bit just about why you're interested in this and how you came to it? I think that's really, sort of our target audience in that sense.
Oh yeah, definitely. But what you were saying about having your parents bring in international visitors and having you welcome them in your home, I am somebody that now that I'm in this work, that's something like, oh, that would be a no-brainer for me. I would love to be able to do that and have those conversations. But when I was just coming from undergrad, I had a background in cultural anthropology and really looking at general social science in a way that focuses on Oregon specifically. And I had no idea that we had a World Affairs Council organization in our state, let alone what that process was until I got an internship program.
Don't tell me that. I mean, we all know that World Affairs Councils are here and we're strong. No, I had no idea there was a World Affairs Council.
Now I know. Don't worry.
Started there too.
And, I came in to this program as an intern. I came into World Oregon as, yes, I came into World Oregon as an intern with this program here in Oregon called Emerging Leaders, and not to be confused with our network-wide Emerging Leaders. I love how we have terms that are similar across platforms, and we have to really clarify what those are. But really taking the understanding that where I'm coming from is, how do we take what's happening here in Oregon and connect that to what's happening around the world? And I think our programs do that so perfectly, because not only are we bringing professional leaders from across the world who are not only just starting in their career, but really established in their career to our home here, but we're also sharing a meal. We're having discussions about what it means to not only work in, for example, social entrepreneurship or minority participation in the political process. We also had a group on political cartoonists one time come through, and really
amazing.
Right? There's just the scope of conversations that can be had in Oregon that I didn't make the connections to before until coming into these conversations and this platform. But there's just so much that we don't realize is right next door to us, that I think it made it very difficult to understand just all the other conversations that are happening around the world. But now that I'm here, now that this is the air that I breathe, the world is my neighbor. You know what I mean? It's such a small world. And the more you have those conversations, the more you start experiencing how somebody in Azerbaijan could have a very similar life experience to me here at home that I would have never thought about before. I didn't even know where Azerbaijan was. I'm going to call myself out really quick before going into here. You know what I mean? And then, here we are, and understanding that there's such a wonderful wealth of information that's happening out there, that having these beginning conversations about who are the key players in foreign policy, what are some of the schools of thought in diplomacy, like really taking those beginning conversations would have been so nice for me to have, instead of taking the long road and having to navigate through going to these state dinners or DC meetings and having to be like, I don't know what's going on here, so I'm going to stay a little bit in the background and learn from there. I want to be able to have platforms like this be that initial resource, so that there's a little bit more comfort, and people who are just coming into this career field or this whole arena that foreign policy is, and really have those conversations, start their conversations regardless of how comfortable they are.
Well, that's what I really hope people get from all of this, is that this doesn't have to be scary. It doesn't have to be so heavy and dense and something that you have to be a policy wonk in order to understand. That's what we're here for. That's what we want to do, particularly with this podcast. And seeing as how my glass is now basically empty, Bill has already gone for a refill. Andrea, you got a little catching up to do, but that's okay. We'll get you there. But I want to thank everyone for joining us for this episode. We really hope that you took some good takeaways from it. But I just want to give Bill a final opportunity for any final thoughts or questions, things that we may have missed here today that you think is important.
Well, again, this was so fun to be with you both, and I look forward to the rest of the podcasts, and we will be glad to share them with the World Affairs Councils of America's network. I was thinking, Andrea, as you were mentioning that I had an opportunity to dine with the Libyan ambassador shortly after there was an agreement about treasures that were going to be returned to that country. Think about all the conquest that has happened over decades and centuries, where artistic treasures and so forth have been taken from their homeland and wind up in usually the museums of wealthy countries. And there are now discussions about provenance and where these should be returned. That's diplomacy. I'm relating it also to the conversation about how do you get in? I mean, artists are there. People who are really good at negotiating. They might be former business people who wind up thinking that this is a passion and they're going to do good by participating in a NGO, a non-governmental organization that's mission is to, make sure art is where it belongs and cultural heritage artifacts are preserved for us to consider what came before and how we can make our planet and our lives and societies within that function better, be fairer, be more peaceful, and enjoy life.
Right. So, punto aparte, main thing is that foreign policy is all around us, whether it's listening to a conversation from the president or whether it's taking a drink of sangria. We are understanding that everywhere we look, basically, there is a reflection of foreign policy and how we're having these conversations. And just wanted to send a huge thank you again to you, Bill, for joining us. And a thank you to my co-host, Tim, for just making this conversation happen. I'm really looking forward, like you were saying, to the future of this podcast and the other episodes, the discussions we have coming. So did we want to do a final cheers before logging off?
Here.
Okay, we can get our countdown going again. A nice 3, 2, 1. Saludos.
Skål.
Salud. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And we'll see you next time on Drinks and Diplomacy.
The Drinks and Diplomacy podcast is a joint program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire and World Oregon.
Your co-hosts and producers are Andrea Castillo, Program Officer at World Oregon, and Tim Horgan, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire.
The audio editor is Tim Horgan.
Our theme music is We Are One by Scott Holmes Music.
Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and leave us a comment. Until next time.